Can software developer productivity be measured? Can you turn the effectiveness of a person or a team into a single number that can be tracked and compared? This is the holy grail for software managers, but often a developer's nightmare. For the next half hour, my guests and I will explore and debate this topic, recorded live on Twitch in this episode of Dev Matters. My guest today is Dylan Etkin. Dylan is another longtime Atlassian and my co-founder and CEO at Sleuth. Dylan and I first met in Atlassian back in 2006 when he was a Jira architect. Since then, he's been the engineering lead for products including Bitbucket and StatusPage. I'm excited to have him to come to talk on this topic as Dylan has been a developer, an architect, and an engineering manager, which should give him a unique perspective. Welcome, Dylan.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to be able to talk about this topic with you. I think we're going to have some fun.
All right, so let's get right into it. Can developer productivity be measured?
I'm going to give you a half answer and say, no, it can't, but yes, it can. And what I mean by that is I don't think there's any magic number. I don't think we give Joe a 10 and Susie a 12, and that those two relate to each other. But you can absolutely figure out if your team is productive, and you can figure out how to increase productivity. And I believe that there's a heap of things you can do to set the groundwork so that you can have a productive team.
Okay, so you seem to have, so your position is yes and no. There are some useful numbers, but not one number could do it. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think somebody on your comments basically said like lines of code, right? And I think we all understand that that doesn't mean anything. Like lines of code, lines of schmode, like there's nothing to that, right? You could write, 3 lines of code and be like the most amazing productive person, and that took you 4 days because they were 3 terribly important and hard lines of code. So like that really that sort of thing just doesn't mean anything.
All right, give me some examples. So you're saying that some can be good, some can be bad. Have you ever had a time or a job where you did have a metric that you were working for that was a terrible idea?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been on teams where something like story points has been like really good for a team, but I've also been on a team where story points was terrible, right? Or we were like counting jelly beans or whatever it was that we decided, and like, you know, it just doesn't have different people work differently, and like when you happen to have a team where those things align, it kind of works great. But I think when you have a team where there's like you're just working on different levels of that amount of thing, it can be really harmful to the team. So yeah.
So that's an interesting one. So I guess there's two. I guess we probably should break down the metrics into two types. One is individual developer productivity. Like, can you measure one person and say that this person is better than that? And then the second is a team. Can you measure productivity in a team? So on the first one, it kind of sounds like you're saying that no, you can't measure a developer stat. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think I mean, yeah, I think it's difficult to measure an individual developer. I think you can. I think the way that you talk about these things though is about like the things that you want to get done, the things that you want to ship, and the things like what have you deployed, what have you actually finished, or like how have you gotten something across the line, uh, and that can be an individual thing, but I don't know if it breaks down into a number.
Okay, so for all practice, in practice, you can't really do a person. But let's talk about the team one because I agree with you. I think trying to measure a person is silly. I mean, I think there's some things like, for example, in Sleuth, you can measure the deployments, the number of deployments, and give a score. We have a little leaderboard, but it's more of a kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. Like, oh, it's kind of fun that I've done the most deployments, so I'm on top. But I would think that no manager would ever think that that's actually an okay thing to measure somebody based on one metric. Would you agree?
I would hope not. I think, and you see this, right? Like, and I get it. Like, there's always a backlash from developers when you start to talk about these things, right? People are scared to death that they're going to go into their performance review and somebody's going to say, "Oh, you got 17, and this other person got like 55, so you must be terrible." And that's not the point of any of this stuff, right? But I do think there's some interesting things out there. Like your change lead time, like is an interesting thing to talk about. And again, super dependent on whether I gave you the hardest problem known to man or if I gave you sort of like a simple bug fix. But I also think that probably brings into play like how does the team approach batch size, right? And so again, a lot of these things are hard to tease out. Like you can talk about it at the individual level, but I think you have to understand like how is your team set up to function, and have you allowed for the individual to succeed in terms of these things that you're shooting for? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That makes sense. I think part of the problem is that how I would view it is metrics themselves are good. Like it's good to have data because data points gives you something to compare against. It gives you just a little bit of insight. The problem with individual metrics is when you have a manager who doesn't understand their context, and their context is just another little piece of information because as humans, we want to just pick on one number, say that's the answer. Now we do everything toward that, put our OKR targets against it, and we're done. But that's where I think it all goes evil. So I guess I would argue that developer metrics are good. Tell me lines of code I've written. I don't even mind that one. Tell me
Mhm.
bugs that I've introduced. Tell me how many deploys I've done. That's fine. What I worry about is that information in the hands of someone who doesn't understand how it's used. So it's kind of like a tool. Tools can be good or they can be bad. You can have a car and kill people. You can have a car and take your kids to daycare. It's
Yeah.
not the problem isn't the tool. The problem is how it's used.
I think you're right, and it reminds me of like the way that we talk about SREs and incidents, and there's this idea of like a blameless culture, and so in a blameless culture where everybody's deploying frequently and you screw up, the idea is like it's not that you screwed up, but yeah, we're gonna say it. We're gonna say like, okay, this problem was introduced when Don did X, Y, and Z, and it's not to blame you, it's to learn and to understand, and we're all gonna jump in and we're all gonna like get things back into normal, and then we're gonna like figure out how to not do it again. But again, like that's like the what's the cultural fabric that you're working within in order to make that okay. And it's similar, I think, with like developer productivity, right? Like how is your team set up? Like what's important to your team? And if you have this blameless culture, right, then measuring these things are about learning, and I think that's probably the key, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that kind of gets into the second one, which is like, are there some metrics that are better than others? Are there some that will give you a little bit more insight, a little bit more of a useful message? Pseudomaze says we should just collect data and give it to IBM Watson to decide. I like the faith in the knowledge of AI and how it's going to take over the world. You
I
might
for
as
one
well.
welcome our AI overlords.
That's right. I don't know. I know someone who got fired by IBM Watson after working for IBM for 15 years. Oh, just kidding. Oh, damn it. You
Oh,
had me
right.
there for a
Like
minute.
that's crazy.
Holy shit. This just turned into an intervention.
Yeah.
That's not good. Okay, so let's talk about different types of metrics. So some metrics might be better than others. Give me some examples of metrics that you think are not actually that useful.
Ooh, metrics that are not that useful. I think the number of stories resolved without context doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. Lines of code, like doesn't mean really anything to me. I mean, it's kind of curious and interesting, but it doesn't mean anything at all. Um, let's see, what else is useless? There's a lot of useless stats out there, honestly.
I'll challenge you on the lines of code not being useless at all. I read somewhere that said a good developer writes an average of 7 lines of code, or no, sorry, 9 lines of code a day. Now, that's
Just
taking into
deleting.
account future refactorings, that's taking into account bugs and rewrites and days where you don't do anything. They said on average, if you can do 9 lines of production quality code, then that's a good day.
It's that but it's the context, right? Like so like you do that giant refactor where you rip out all the old templates, right? And now you've removed like 40,000 lines, or somebody introduces like black for formatting and now they own your entire code base, right? Like
That's a
not
hypothetical example, right?
hypothetical
Yeah, yeah.
completely. Yeah,
Because
it's
I'm
always
still
gone
number
to
one
that,
in
by the
lines of
way.
code. Just want to
You
point that
are.
out.
Yeah, yeah. I was before that, but I was the only committer. So what are
And
you
you
gonna
didn't
do?
know about black.
That's a good point. So I think it's too wonky, it's too misleading, right? And I think, we're probably going to end up talking about these, but the accelerate metrics I think are interesting because they've tried to like abstract out those factors that are like really weird, right? And it's much more about, and I think the one thing that they're maybe missing out that I miss is this idea of batch size, right? So like this thought of like, okay, how productive am I? Well, as a team, are you reducing your batch size, right? So that you're setting your team up for success. You're setting your individuals up for success such that you're shipping in really small batches, right? And then if you are, like, frequency of deploys, like that is something that is, like meaningful. You're like, how often is the code flowing? Are we getting stuck at any given time? And it doesn't matter, like what that number is absolutely, but you want to understand over time. And then the others as well, like start to play into that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Pseudo Maze says that actually he was serious when he said he knew someone that got fired by IBM Watson after working for IBM for 15 years.
Wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, that puts metrics in a whole different light. When you could be fired by an AI that's using these metrics after no matter how long you've worked there or whatever, that's
So
disturbing.
here's a
But I think that
controversial thing. I mean, you'd probably agree with this too. I've I've seen teams where most of them probably should have been fired 15 years ago, right? And like
yes,
that's I don't know. Like I don't know if that's metrics or if like somebody finally got wise or who knows, right? Like it seems odd that the AI would have gotten wise, but you know,
that's a good point. That's a good point. That said, it's not necessarily the case in Pseudo Maze's friends, just to draw that distinction. Just saying you
absolutely. I
have
don't know
seen
anything
that
about that.
before.
That's right.
But yeah, so I have a case of metrics gone bad. Like I used to work at this one company where they had this thing that they invented called BVP, or business value points.
I've
And the
heard of this.
idea behind it is that we could take all the work that we had, all the tasks on the board, and put a business value to those and then track how many. It's basically story points, but done at yearly planning. So they would
Oh,
break all the epics and everything. How many business value points is this epic and whatever. And they tried to use that to drive engineering improvement, saying every year we should do twice as many business value points as we did the year before, which in theory makes sense. You do want to measure what you're doing by how much it's helping customers. However, in practice, it just encourages all kinds of silly gamemanship where you're debating on this one versus that one because you know this one's easier, so you make that one seem a lot more business value points, and you won't do the hard stuff because then that will screw up your um, metrics for the year. So you want to get that metric right. So basically, you have a game of metrics on top of metrics. But then the other thing that I really didn't like about that one is that you had a case where refactoring or performance work almost never had any business value points to it. So it
mm,
became yet another way to get the engineering team to just ship out more and more features. But meanwhile, the backlog of tech debt grew and grew and grew, which therefore meant developing features took longer and longer, and also meant stability got worse, and you had more pissed off customers. But because support didn't have any business value points to give out, it didn't work. So again,
and
that's a
I,
good
you know,
example of it's not a bad idea to think about how much is this helping a customer versus something else. But when it's taken in a very literal way and you put OKRs, which stands for objective key results, it's a way to do goals at the end of the quarter. If you start putting those behind improving the metrics, you can really create a toxic culture that actually will hurt the company a lot.
and I think you nailed it right at the end there. Honestly, like again, it's about culture, and I think that's why so many developers are scared of these things, is because like unfortunately there's a lot of shit culture out there, and they've like stopped at some job somewhere and seen this in play and seen business value points like just like corrupt the system, right? And I mean the things that probably were misaligned there were like executive stakeholders. Didn't respect the entire process, right? Like they didn't respect like like the quality of the software product underlying, right? Like and there wasn't this sort of like sense of everybody in it as a team. So PM and engineering weren't necessarily working hand in hand. And then like like the concept was right. Like well, let's do the most valuable things and let's like measure ourselves on that. But again, I think it's a little too simplistic, and then in the wrong culture, it just leads to toxicity.
Yep, agreed. Hennessy Dev asks, similar to KPIs, OKRs. Yes, it's sim. Well, I'm not a big OKR versus KPI versus all these different goal systems. Some people are really passionate. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Dylan. But basically, at the end of the day, you're saying, what are the three things I'm going to focus on this quarter, and how I'm going to make sure that I do it, and that's all there is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like that's honestly my take to a lot of these dev metrics is like the thing I'm concerned about as an engineering leader is are we delivering the value that like we have decided is the important value, right? And so like yeah, there's some like there's built into some trust into your product management setup. There's built in trust into your executive vision, right? And like those are sort of different things, like but they play into it, right? But at the end of the day, even if you want my engineering team to build like something that seems a little silly, I'd like to figure out how we can do it in the most effective and efficient way that gets us to like a really good end product, even if it's a dumb one that like somebody didn't think through. And I think the measures that you put in place and that culture that you put in place again is about getting there in the most efficient way. And so like understanding, do you have a system where your code is flowing? Are you a team that just ships bug after bug after bug, and then like you're basically unable to move forward because you're too busy under the mountain of debt that you accumulate every time you deploy, right? Or do you not have like a good feedback loop between like your design and your PM and your engineers, such that you're having to do rework and rework and rework? So there's like some of these meta things that you can measure that's more about how efficiently is your team able to get shit across the line.
Yep, that's a good point. Pseudomaze quotes Goodhart's law: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. That's a good one. I'm gonna Google that one afterwards.
Ceases to become a good measure. Interesting. Well, I
So
mean, I would challenge that a little bit. Like, so, I mean, if you're in a healthy culture, right, and you have hit like, let's say you're doing continuous deployment, right? Like, we're sleuth folks, so like, that's where our heads are at, right? And like, you're trying to deploy like very quickly. You're trying to have this culture of like, very small batch sizes. I think it's reasonable to say, you want to increase the frequency of your deploys by a certain amount. But I think then you also have to just like not target that number. You have to ask yourself, what would that mean? Does that mean like we want to deploy in smaller batches? Does that mean, we're adding people to the team? Like, like, does that mean we need like PM needs to change the way that they're thinking about what's reasonable to ship? Does it mean we start putting absolutely everything behind a feature flag? Like, I think it's okay to have that target. But then it's how do you go about, you know, hitting it?
right, yeah, I'd probably say it's a good rule of thumb, the place to start from. But I agree that you
Mhm.
can have it, and that's where you go back to culture. It's not about the measurements; it's about the culture and how they interpret it. Which, before I get to the next section, I did want to ask you a quick question because you said the word story points. That is a pet peeve of mine. I can't stand them and I hate them and I hope they die. And I feel
Yep.
like you might disagree with that. So I did want to ask you a question on that. But first,
Yeah.
let's have a word from our sponsors.
Okay.
Do you want to ship code more frequently? Are deployments stressful events that you avoid? Well, Sleuth can help, and let me show you how. Sleuth is deployment mission control for shipping continuously. It helps developers coordinate and track the health and progress of deploys so that they have the trust they need to ship code faster. Modernizing a dev team is a tall order, but one that pays off in both productivity and developer happiness. Sleuth might be just what you need to pull it off. And we're back. I got to do a commercial break. I've always wanted to do one
Excellent.
of those.
Nice.
All right, so
Not the
story
streaming
points.
area where you don't get commercials.
Yeah, I never have commercials anymore. It's more
That's
like
all right.
old time radio.
Mm.
But that I need to do it like really like old time radio where they would have a TV show and then like they would do something and then stop and say, "I'm using this shampoo. It's
That's
great."
right. That's
And
right.
then and then
Water. Everybody should have some.
yep, and then smoothly go right back to what you were doing.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's next level. I'm getting
Yeah.
there.
We should
All
have
right,
some
so
product placement too.
Yes, product. Yeah, right, well, I guess we do have the Sleuth logo, so it's not exactly
There you
subtle here. Yeah,
go.
and same. So, we do what we can.
Okay, story points.
Story points. Tell me why I'm wrong and why they aren't the devil's spawn.
Okay, I here you go. I don't think you're wrong, and here's what I have learned through my engineering leadership journey. Uh, for me, they don't mean a lot. However, I had an experience with Status Page where I had some really great team leads working for me, and I tried to give them as much leeway as possible because I think that's the way that you grow, and that's how it should be. And so my mandate was I don't give a shit. Like you guys need to get a certain amount of work done. You need to have an effective team. You guys should work the way that you work. And the way that that meant for me when I sort of had set things up was I don't care about story points. I just care about like shipping work. Um, but then a couple of these folks found that their sub teams really did like the story points, right? Like, and basically they used this concept of velocity. And I think again, like the things that made that a success were they had a team of like kind of like equally skilled folks, right? They had they didn't have like necessarily any underperformers or any things. Then they also were working in very small batch sizes. So like when they could point, like they were pretty much pointing twos and fours instead of like eights and 16s and like 48s. And so they did get to a place where they could kind of like see their velocity, and then that helped them plan. They had that traditional problem of over planning, right? And like that allowed them to kind of get back to a place where they felt like they could be a little more realistic about what they were going to commit to. But again, not for me. Like when I have like worked in a team lead role, I'm like, yeah, jelly beans, fucking hate them. Although in real life, I like jelly beans.
Oh yeah, of course, because jelly beans are the best. Yeah, I
Yes.
like the idea of putting numbers to it and tracking velocity. I guess what I always objected to is the story point concept because in your
Mm.
head you're always translating into hours,
Oh,
and so
every
why not
time.
just translate the damn thing to hours and just call it a day? 2 hours, four
Yeah.
hours, eight. Just say that. Just instead of being like, oh, but it's three story points.
But then you get to stop at the debate, which is, hey, realistically, we don't work 8 hours a day. So do we call it an eight or do we call it a four because we only get 4 hours between the meetings and the things and the coffees and the stuffs and whatever? And then you're like, is that eight for slow Joe or is that eight for like super fast Willie? You know,
Right.
and ah, yes.
Yep. I will say
Um,
there's one thing about that whole planning process that I liked, and honestly, I only did it in a team like twice. So this might just me be talking like in a perfect world where I never actually did it, not practice when I preach, but I did planning poker once. Did you ever do planning poker in any of your teams?
I thought you were gonna say that, and it's so funny because that's the part I hate.
Okay, because I only did it once, and that one time I'm like, this is actually kind of cool, but I never did it again, so clearly it wasn't that cool. Now,
It's
planning poker, just real
cool.
quickly for anyone who doesn't know, basically what you do is you take a task off a wall, and everybody, it depends how you do it, but basically somehow everyone estimates it. I might think this is a 2 hour task. You might think this is a 4 hour task. You might six, whatever. You come up with your number, and then we go one, two, three, and then we all show our number. And then I said it was a 2 hour task. Dylan said it was a 2 day task. Now we have a conversation. Why do you think it's a 2 day task? Well, because you're forgetting this and this. I'm like, oh, but those are already solved in this thing. That's why I thought it was two. So you try to help understand the scope of what you're working on. So I thought that was a cool interaction to have
Mm.
in theory.
Yeah. I think in theory it's a great idea too. And if you've got everybody who's engaged at the same level, that's great. But traditionally, what I've seen is that like you get two people who think they know a lot about the system, and then the rest of them are just checked out and they're like, I don't care. I'll just vote whatever you vote, and it sort of breaks down in that way. Um, I think the thing that drives me crazy about story points the most is like the 48s, right? Where you're just like the team refuses to like there it's not possible to reduce this batch size any lower, right? And like we've always had teams that have like hard limits on like how high we're willing to go, and we say, hey, if it's bigger than an 8, we're going to break it down. But then invariably somebody's like, oh, I gotta go, I don't know, it's really hard, so it's we gotta make it a 48. And you're just like, well, now this whole system's broken.
Right. Okay. So I don't know if chat, if you have better experiences in story points, it possibly could be this is one of those rare cases where Dylan and I are curmudgeons on the same side, which is nice.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Pseudomay says it's a language for PMs to communicate with devs because they can't be too technical. That kind of makes sense. But then I don't know if I'd want to have even a PM saying story points. That still
Yeah,
feels
no, that's
dangerous.
terrifying. Yeah, I don't think that's their place. Like, because this, yeah, it's about, alignment with individuals about how long we think a thing should take. But again, I look, we should talk about accelerate metrics because I think there's a better way. I think some of these things are like left over from the past, and like we tried them and we have these war stories about why they kind of suck, or they're not getting at the value that we want. I think at the end of the day, teams want to be healthy teams. They need measurements so that they know they're healthy, but we're trying to deliver value efficiently and learn, you know?
And with that, let's talk about the accelerate specifically. You mentioned several times, and the term accelerate metrics is thrown out all the time. In fact, I'm throwing out in the subtitles here today in the lower third. What is accelerate metrics? What are they, and how would you use them? Why are they any better than story points?
Gotcha. Well, I think they're also known as door metrics or like the big four or whatever. There's that book that came out recently, but there's basically the state of DevOps report, which has a ton of great research. The authors of those reports, after a couple of years, like encapsulated all their stuff in a book called Accelerate. It's kind of one of the Bibles of the DevOps movement. And I think DevOps, can get a bad rap based on like who's had experiences with what. But for me, what it ends up meaning is like frequent deploys and this idea of like shipping continuously, and just trying to keep that code flowing. And I think the place where those metrics succeed, where maybe others have failed more in the past, is the the t-shirt sizing or the abstraction that is coming from them, right? And again, so like I feel like I have to explain a little bit what I mean by that. Like with story points, we've talked about some of the downsides of that. With deploy frequency, you're really talking about like measuring when the rubber hit the road, right? It's not like, hey, this story was done. Like I have this like thing from my past where there was a team I worked on where they called it Dylan done because like I would always make this like they're like, hey, this is done, and I'm like, is it really done? And they're like, no, I still have to ship it to staging and I still have to ship it to production and then I have to write the docs and then I have to whatever. And I'm like, so you're not done. You're going to spend the next week on this thing. And deploying, like even though you have some post deploy tasks, is a pretty good proxy for like, did I get something done? And then again, like, if as a team you have like a reasonably uniform batch size, it starts to be this thing where you're like, okay, well, like that's the frequency at which we're shipping those batches, which I think is a more interesting way to think about things than say like story points.
Okay, so just to summarize, there was a state of DevOps report where I think they surveyed like, what was it, 26,000 people or
It was a lot,
it was a lot of people. And
more than
what they,
five.
and their goal was to find out what drove highly productive teams. And they
Mm-hmm.
found that there were a number of factors, but they kind of distilled it down into four metrics. If you scored higher on these four metrics, you were a better you were a better producing team. And so, in a way, I guess these metrics do score or give you a number to measure developer productivity. Is that right?
It's almost like the thing that we were talking about, though. Maybe it's like your team's effectiveness, right? Because well, I mean, like let's talk about the four, right? It's like deploy frequency. It's the change lead time, which is the amount of time between your first commit and deploy. It's the change failure rate, which I think is an interesting one because that can be anything for any different team. But like, imagine it's whatever the qualification of failure is for your team. Maybe you caused a new bug or you had an incident or whatever. It's the amount of times that you deploy that you fail, and then it's the mean time to recovery, which is how long does it take you to unfail, right? Like once you've failed, like how do you get back to a normal state? And I think those are very interesting because again, that's uh, it's interesting from an individual perspective for sure. It's much more interesting from a team perspective.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think they are kind of team. I guess you could measure how long it takes you to get back production back to a healthy state when you broke it or something. But yeah, that those
Hmm.
definitely feel like team metrics. Um, if you had to pick your favorite, what would you say?
Ooh, that's a good question. Oh, pick my favorite. I don't know. I like deploy frequency, and maybe that's the cowboy in me a little bit. Like I like the idea of flowing code quickly, and I can give a little bit more as to why. Like if you're gonna do it, you have to have a lot of shit in place in order to pull it off, right? So like you can't just be deploying super frequently and like I'm like, hey, I want to do that, and I want to worry about nothing else, right? So like if you're shipping very frequently, it means that like it implies a lot of things. It implies that like your batch size is low. It implies that like your team is empowered to make their changes, that they understand the things you're asking them to do. It implies that like you have like very smooth interactions between design and PM. It implies that like basically people can get back to their job and like code, which to me always feels like, oh, right on, like this team is healthy. So I think that's my favorite one. Do
Okay.
you have a favorite one?
I am partial to the just number of deploys. It's such a simple metric. How many times you as a developer, you could say a team, but I like to put it down as a developer ships a piece of code just because it feels like so many things fall underneath that. For example,
Yes.
if you shipped it a lot, but then you kept breaking prod, you get fired. And then your number goes to zero. So that solved that problem. It just feels like a lot can be kind of packed underneath that number.
But haven't you seen? So we saw actually. I think you did this where you added a leaderboard to Sleuth, and I think the Sleuth team is healthily competitive, right? Like nobody. It was like kind of a little fun game, especially between you and me at the time. I think like you were ahead, and I was like, well, maybe I could get ahead, a little bit here. But I don't really care. Like it was like a little bit of a game in the middle of the day. Uh, and you blogged about it, and like some people's reaction was like, viscerally horrible. They were like, oh my god, like the worst thing ever would be a manager like judging me on these things because I could just game it if I need to. And I so I mean there is that side of that one, but I think when we talk about these things, we have to assume a non-toxic culture where there's like a degree of safety, and so that you can have a healthy competition. Like um, otherwise it is scary.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, really, you could have the best metrics and the best tools and whatever, and if you have a toxic culture or a bad manager, you're screwed. That's just the way it is. I will say that number two would for me would be the mean time to recovery because I do
Mm,
believe that it's one thing to go fast, but it's another thing to be able to recover fast. In fact, sometimes when you think about like what is the justification for doing continuous deployment, and people say, oh, it's because I ship code faster. But I kind of feel like a better justification is, I mean, that's true, of course, but I think the better justification is that I can recover from an incident quicker. If I ship the bug, I can roll it back quicker. And that should be
right.
measured in seconds ideally, minutes at worst, but seconds ideally. Because
Yeah.
what that does is that puts a lot less stress on the deployment. It's when I do a release and I'm like, I gotta have the next 8 hours around because it might go bad and there's so many changes I don't know what's in there and it stresses me out. And then if I wanted to roll back, well now I have to figure out which of the 25 changes are the actual bad one, or I roll back everything, but we did a database migration and we can't roll that back, and everything just gets so stressful. So if you can optimize for making it so if you do make a mistake, you can recover quickly. You combine
Hmm.
that with a good incident management process, which says if you have an incident, you spend the time to look at the cause and you fix the cause at the source and combine those two things. And I feel like you'd have a real good company culture right there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, you've seen this too. Is our industry is shifting to this way of working, right? And so, like, whatever, 5, 7 years ago, it was really the bleeding edge teams. Now, I'd say, it's 25% of teams that are kind of working in this manner, right? But the big shift is that 75% recognize that this is where they want to get to, and that they're going to kind of be left behind if they don't. But one of the biggest objections is this counterintuitive objection that like if we're shipping super frequently and like making all these changes all the time, we're just going to continuously be breaking things, and like it's going to be the wild west out there. But the truth is, and the Accelerate book itself like does a great job of pointing this out, is that it's exactly the opposite, and for the reasons that you said. Right, when you're shipping very frequently and you have very small batch sizes, it becomes a non-event to roll back. It becomes a non-event to and you're making such small changes that the surface area that you have to screw up in is quite a bit smaller. And I've always found that interesting, that the biggest objection to this different way of working is exactly the opposite of what the truth is.
Yeah, and Pseudomaze raises a good point, or at least I'm going to take it as a good point, the tech debt, which is when you can deploy quicker, I think that makes you more likely to fix things because I can make this little refactoring and ship it out there. And if it breaks, I know it's exactly my refactoring. I'm not throwing that risk on somebody else, because when I'm throwing it on somebody else, that makes me less likely to do the refactoring because now it's risky and I'm a developer. So I always seek the easiest path I can. And so these little broken windows, these little paper cuts just accumulate and accumulate, and no one feels empowered to go and fix them without some giant tech debt sprint where you put so many of these things together and inevitably one falls, and the management looks at that and says, well, we're not doing that ever again. So I think, yeah, by being able to go quickly and be able to roll back quickly, I think you actually end up solving the tech debt kind of almost automatically.
I'm gonna like back you up on that one and go a little bit further even and say that you to successfully get to a process where you are deploying like multiple times a day, you need to have observability in place. You need to have an understanding of what's going on in your system. And that can be as like naive as just like is the site up or down, but usually it tends to get more nuanced the faster you go. And if you're really bringing those metrics to the individual, to like the dev that's out there, I think that's the visibility and the responsibility that you want to impart to individuals so that they can make those changes. So, for instance, and this is a shameless plug for Sleuth, but what we do is we track impact, and so like for instance, just like last week, we put out a change, and that change took our database CPU from 4% to 25%. Uh, that's not something we want. I mean, it's not something that would fire off alerts, right? So like we totally would have like nobody would have woken up in the night from that. But that's the sort of change like in resource allocation and usage that like I want to know about, right? And on teams of the past, I think what would happen is you'd make that change, and then some SRE maybe 3 weeks later, would say, "Hey, there was a change around then. Like something was weird, but the person who did it, who had context, is like gone or on leave or is like onto something else." And maybe you fix it, or maybe that's your new norm. But I think that in this world of like frequent deploys, when you do have these measures in place, that's your ability to immediately look and say, ah, shit, we made this like way worse. We can't live with this. Like, let's go back to 4%. And you either roll back that change and then like make another attempt, or you like quickly fix the underlying cause like we did.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Well,
So it's
I
like
did
check
want.
that as you go. Sorry.
Yeah, tech. Yes, yes, exactly. It's just all about incremental, small incremental, less risk, and then as you say, monitoring. We didn't even really touch on that, but the importance of monitoring the impact of your change in order to feed this whole system. Without monitoring, then you're just kind of guessing when things are going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to leave a little bit of time for questions. If Gaming Golfer's still around, he said he had two questions, and I know that was ages ago, and I know Gaming Golfer had to put down Little Gaming Golfer, so I'm not sure. Hey, he's still around. He has two, so great. Let me hear him, Gaming Golfer. And if anyone else has any questions, Dylan and I could probably talk on this topic forever, so probably should call it at some point. So this is a good time for that.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting enough to us that we created a startup around it. So it's
Yes.
obviously something we like.
I'm pretty proud of us for taking this long to shamelessly plug Sleuth in a topic about metrics and continuous deployment. So come on, get some
Yeah.
credit there. Gaming Golfer asks, Dylan, you mentioned that you don't like using metrics to measure two people against each other, but what about, and have you ever used metrics to measure someone against themselves? Have you ever compared Jim's performance last year to this time last year using metrics?
Right. Okay, so I have definitely, as an engineering leader, had to compare somebody to themselves. But I'll be honest, like it's very rarely the case that you need a lot of metrics to do that. So in the case where somebody's performance has changed like pretty dramatically, if you're an engineering leader worth your salt, like that comes through, and you understand, like you're having one-on-ones with that individual, you understand what's going on in their personal life or their engagement levels, and like yes, it is good like when you're going to talk to somebody about like a change to have real world examples, and I absolutely always try and do that where I but I, like my thing will be is I'll say here's an example, here's an example, here's an example. I don't want to focus on those specific examples. I want to focus on a larger trend. And so no, not like a metric where I'm like, hey, you used to get 17 story points done, whatever, and now you're getting two. But I think it is like your productivity has dropped over the last year, and like we can see it through like your overall engagement, like your attitude is down, like what's going on, that sort of thing. So maybe to support, but certainly not to like bring to my attention that the person is struggling.
I think that's an important distinction to be made. It feels like as a manager, and unfortunately, I have had, well, I guess I am now, so I can't really say that, but have had people report to me, but it's a very subjective thing. And so it kind of feels like, as a manager, you would love that conversation to be, oh, you were a 43, now you're a 22, so therefore let's talk, because it's just simpler. It's almost it's not a scapegoat, but it's you're letting go of any responsibility of
Mm-hmm.
evaluating the person. And as you say, it's not just about what they code, it's about how they work with other people, it's about how other people like working with them, it's about how they're communicating, it's about so many more things than simply you wrote this many lines of code or this many story points. So
Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, I would agree. It's something that it might be interesting, but I honestly, I would probably avoid bringing it up because they
Mm.
would say, "Well, how'd you get that number?" And they would start digging into it, and that's not really the point. And
That's
even if,
that's
and
the danger with the examples too. Is usually you'll get somebody who wants to debate each and every example, and that's why you need to have like three where you're like, I only bring these up to say that there's a trend. You know what I mean? And I want to discuss the trend. So like, what's going on behind those three? Like, there's probably 17 others. Like
yeah, and it's a little bit of a, well, I mean, I guess you should always make the point that if you're having a surprise at a performance review, that's a problem as a
that's a problem
manager.
too.
That's your job,
Oh
is to
God,
make sure they're aware of it the whole time.
you screwed up, not the individual.
Yeah, but I guess the second part is crap. I lost my thought. But anyways, the first part was good, so that gets partial credit. Uh, Hennessy Dev has one question. I'm just starting to learn Python. Have any resources you could recommend? Just solving code wars at the moment and piecing things together, but I wouldn't remind a good resource to refer in more detail. There is, let me see if I can find it for you. I'll give you what I usually give folks that ask this. And actually, I would recommend you join the Discord, because on the Discord, we answer those kind of questions and other people jump in as well. So if the stream isn't going on, that might be a good place. But if I were you, I would look at something like this, which is going to be a list of different Python projects that will get you started in something. Because the thing with learning Python is it's not about learning the if statements, although that's important, but it's about having a purpose for learning. And that might
Oh,
be a game,
absolutely.
that might be a mobile app, whatever it is. But you want to have that thing that drives. So I always recommend people taking a project based approach versus a series of exercises approach. I don't know. What do you think about that, Dylan?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. My daughter, funny enough, is learning Python in university right now. And like her and I have spent time on these like problems, and like there's nothing that makes me more upset. I'm like, this is stupid. I'm like, this is like super contrived, and like they love to use like variables like X and Y and Z, and I'm like, what is this even like? I would fire you if you did this. Um, but yeah, I think like working on something like even if it's if it's interesting to you, that's even better, right? Like but like you're gonna write some code that's not so great, but like solving a problem with a purpose. I agree with you completely. That's the best way to learn.
Gaming Golfer asks Dylan. Oh, actually, first, Andy asks, is Sleuth hiring? Dylan,
Is Sleuth
CEO?
hiring? uh at the moment, Sleuth is not hiring, but that can change at any time. So we've been lucky, and we've actually found some amazing, wonderful people that have joined the team. We hired somebody just a few weeks back, and so we don't have an open role right now, but don't touch that dial, as Don would say.
And I guess it also doesn't hurt to send over CVs. It's not.
Absolutely.
So when we have a list of people to chat with, so that's good. Gaming Golfer asks, in your major roles of architect, developer, and engineering manager, which did you learn the most from? Which do you feel the most comfortable? And which do you prefer doing?
Oh
Holy
man.
shit. Go.
Damn. Wait, how much time do we have? Uh yeah, that's a great question. Jeez, man. Okay. Learned the most in okay, it's been an evolution, right? So like I started writing a bunch of code and then I started like designing stuff for a team of people and running that team of people and then like being an engineering leader and like and an architect and and then like a CEO of a small company. I can definitely say like I didn't enjoy the architect role as much. Personally, I like being able to get things done and like maybe it was just the maturity level of the organization where I was an architect at the time, but like I you didn't have as much ability to impact and set like scheduling and sort of like the things that should get done. Um, but learn the most, I'd say, as an engineering leader. It's one of these things, and I always talk to the folks that work with me or work under me that are getting their way into engineering leadership. A lot of people go through this similar thing where you go from usually being like a really great IC to being an eng leader, which is like very different. You have to get your joy from somewhere else, and it's not for everyone. And not everybody can sort of find that joy. But like in my process, I did and I've definitely seen instances where like a bad leader makes everything crappy and a good leader makes everything really great. um, and the story I've told like a million times, but not to you guys, is like let's say you're an amazing IC and you can produce at a 5. Let's just like choose a number. This is about metrics, so let's just choose a number. Like most people in the world can produce at like a 3. Like if you were to have a lot of jolt and like stay up all night, maybe you could reach a 6, but like a 7 is like impossible, right? Like that's just not physically possible for you to produce at that level. um, when you move into engineering leadership and you have a team of people, all of a sudden you have like somebody who can do a 3 and somebody who can do a 5 and somebody who can do a 7 and somebody who can do whatever, right? And like you get to start to think about the overall activity in terms of like how much you as a team can complete, and then you start to think in terms of like 35. And I think when you start to think like that, it's hard to go back to being an IC, at least for me, because then I can only really like pull a 5 out of myself. And so like for myself, I took a lot of like joy in that. And I think like the learning that I had around like people and keeping people happy and stuff, that's probably the time that I learned the most. And probably running your own startup is a pretty heavy learning curve too.
That is an excellent observation. All right. Well, I think on that, is there any other questions? Just I'll give you one last minute. Pseudomace does ask if you will fire her as a daughter. I'm guessing your daughter learning Python.
No, no, no. Nothing could ever happen that I would fire her as a daughter. That would never happen.
I
All
do
the
like how
metrics
we go
are
this whole thing and talk about how you can't measure people into a single number, and what do? Your story at the end is about
a single
measuring
number.
people underneath you as a single number. That's
It's
awesome.
just an example. It's the amplifying power of teams. That's all.
Sure, say all the fancy words, but the fact remains.
Yeah, I gave them all a number. Yep. In
Well,
my
thank
head,
you.
I'm giving everybody a number.
Of course, of course. I've seen that Black Mirror episode.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan, for coming on. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you for participating. That was super fun. It was fun to do an
Yeah.
interview and have all the interactions. And if you have any ideas on other episodes or topics that we should have, please let me know in the Discord or in chat. And we'll let the last word be from our sponsor, Sleuth, the #1 solution for implementing team-based productivity metrics for you and your team. Bye. Do you want to ship code more frequently? Are deployment stressful events that you avoid? Well, Sleuth can help, and let me show you how. Sleuth is deployment mission control for shipping continuously. It helps developers coordinate and track the health and progress of deploys so that they have the trust they need to ship code faster. Modernizing a dev team is a tall order, but one that pays off in both productivity and developer happiness. Sleuth might be just what you need to pull it off. Don't break. Okay, we're good. All right, okay, we're recording now. Now it matters. Although I guess it doesn't matter. Okay. One more time. We might do some light editing.
Can I let my cat out of the room?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh, shit. Yeah, I was hoping to do it all in one take. That might be a little bit aggressive. Can software develop? Damn it, Dylan! That was a good one. That was my perfect take. Okay, here we go. Yes, maybe we're not exactly one take. It might be more than that. Because those are
these are people trying to be productive.
Those are people being productive. And look, there's a computer. Computer makes sense.
They got spreadsheets there. So
yeah. And that's a wrap.